Trump reportedly waged all-out war on Iran this week, then pulled back. Here's what changed, and what didn't. In the next several minutes, I'll break down the Wall Street Journal report that Trump discussed resuming full-scale strikes on Iran, why he held off, the weekend of real fighting that pushed things to the brink, how we got here, and what's happening right now in the Doha talks. According to the Wall Street Journal, President Trump held multiple conversations this week with Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth and Joint Chiefs Chairman General Dan Kane about abandoning negotiations with Iran and resuming full-scale military strikes. It comes as a fragile ceasefire, signed June 17th by Trump and Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian, hangs by a thread after a weekend of real fighting in the Gulf. That ceasefire followed months of escalation stretching back to early this year, and understanding this week's decision means understanding that longer road first. To understand why Trump was even weighing a return to war, start with how this conflict began. In January, mass protests broke out across Iran, the largest since the 1979 revolution, fueled by an economic collapse tied to new international sanctions. On January 8th, Iranian security forces launched a violent crackdown. According to Iran's own Ministry of Health, cited by Britannica, at least 30,000 people were killed. That figure comes from the Iranian government itself, not an independent monitor, so it should be treated as a claimed toll rather than a confirmed one. President Trump had publicly warned of U.S. intervention if the crackdown turned deadly. In its aftermath, the United States began what analysts describe as its largest military buildup in the Middle East since the 2003 invasion of Iraq, carrier strike groups, additional aircraft, and expanded basing across the region. On February 28th, U.S. and Israeli forces conducted joint strikes inside Iran, opening what is now referred to as the 2026 Iran War. That in turn followed the shorter 12-day war the previous June, when Israel struck Iranian military and nuclear sites, and the United States followed with strikes on 3 underground facilities, Fordow, Natanz, and Isfahan, using bunker-buster bombs. A preliminary U.S. Defense Intelligence Agency assessment suggested those 2025 strikes only set Iran's nuclear program back by months, not years, an assessment the Trump administration characterized at the time as a politically motivated leak. Diplomacy resumed in February of this year. On February 6th, U.S. and Iranian officials held indirect talks in Muscat, Oman. Secretary of State Marco Rubio publicly voiced doubt about reaching a deal at all, saying he wasn't sure an agreement was possible. Vice President J.D. Vance expressed frustration that Iran's supreme leader wasn't personally involved. 3 weeks later, at a further round of talks in Geneva, U.S. envoys Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner reportedly demanded that Iran dismantle its 3 main nuclear sites entirely and hand over its remaining enriched uranium stockpile. Those demands went nowhere. By April, talks had moved to Islamabad, mediated in part by Pakistan. On April 12th, Vance left those talks saying no agreement had been reached. The following day, Trump ordered a U.S. naval blockade of Iranian ports. 2 more weeks of shuttle diplomacy failed to close the distance, and on April 25th, Trump canceled a planned envoy trip, citing what he called divisions inside Iran's own leadership. It's against that backdrop, a full year of failed talks, a blockade, and an active shooting war, that the current ceasefire, and this week's reported deliberations over resuming it, need to be understood. This is not a story that started this month. It is the latest chapter in a conflict that has already gone through several rounds of fighting, failed diplomacy, and fragile pauses. The current ceasefire took shape in mid-June. On June 14th, Pakistani Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif, acting as a key mediator, announced that the United States and Iran had finalized a memorandum of understanding. Minutes later, Trump announced on social media the immediate lifting of the naval blockade. The 14-point memorandum was formally signed on June 17th by Trump and Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian. It called for an end to hostilities in Lebanon, a resolution to restrictions on the Strait of Hormuz, a partial drawdown of U.S. military assets from the region, and sanctions relief tied to Iran's reconstruction. Crucially, it also set a 60-day window, ending August 18th, to negotiate a permanent agreement on Iran's nuclear program, with Iran reaffirming it would not pursue a nuclear weapon. Just days earlier, on June 11th, Trump told reporters in the Oval Office that renewed U.S. military action had finally pushed Tehran toward a deal. He said Iran had taken a pounding and wanted an agreement more than the United States did. That optimism didn't last. Within days of the June 17th signing, Iran claimed it had reclosed the Strait of Hormuz, citing Israeli strikes in Lebanon as a violation of the deal, a claim the U.S. military denied. Shipping through the strait stalled, and some vessels began disabling their tracking systems to avoid Iranian detection near the Omani coastline. Then came last weekend's direct clash. On Friday, U.S. forces struck Iranian missile and drone storage sites and coastal radar installations, retaliating for a drone strike on the cargo ship Ever Lovely as it exited the strait. Early Saturday, Iran struck again, hitting the oil tanker Kiku. U.S. Central Command responded with a further wave of strikes, targeting Iranian surveillance infrastructure, communication systems, air defense sites, drone storage, and mine-laying capability. That night, Trump posted a stark warning. "If the U.S. is ever forced to militarily complete the job," he wrote, "the Islamic Republic of Iran will no longer exist." Hours later, Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps retaliated against U.S.-linked sites in Bahrain and Kuwait. Bahrain's foreign ministry called it a dangerous escalation. Kuwait condemned what it called repeated heinous attacks. U.S. officials say there were no American casualties and no significant damage to American facilities. Iran, in turn, insisted the U.S. strikes themselves violated the June 18th ceasefire memorandum, and its top military command warned any further American attack would trigger a response even more severe than before. Both governments, in the same weekend, accused each other of breaking the same agreement, the direct backdrop for the war options Trump was reportedly weighing days later with Hegseth and Kane. But here's the part most people are missing. While headlines are focused on the threat of all-out war, the more revealing detail in the journal's report may be the opposite one. Trump's reported willingness to let the diplomatic clock run well past its original deadline. According to the Wall Street Journal, Trump told aides he's comfortable if the nuclear negotiations extend beyond August 18th. For now, the report says, he remains satisfied with a narrower approach, one-off retaliatory strikes whenever Iran violates the memorandum, rather than a full return to war. That's a meaningful distinction. Full-scale strikes would mean resuming a bombing campaign on the scale of the 12-day war or February's joint strikes. One-off strikes are narrower, targeted responses, a middle path the administration appears to be using right now, even while keeping the larger option on the table. It's worth repeating, too, that this specific all-out war account is sourced to a single outlet, citing unnamed officials, and has not been independently confirmed by separate reporting, though it has gone unchallenged by the administration. That diplomatic track is playing out live this week. Special Envoy Steve Witkoff and Senior Advisor Jared Kushner are in Doha for a fresh round of indirect, mediator-led talks, hosted by Qatar. Qatar's Prime Minister met with both envoys Tuesday, and Qatari officials say positive progress is being made on the underlying memorandum. Notably, Iran reportedly declined a direct sit-down with Witkoff and Kushner themselves, leaving detailed work to lower-level technical negotiators. A sign trust between the two sides remains thin, even as talks continue. Regional analysts have argued Trump has strong incentives to avoid a prolonged new war this year, given the economic risk and political stakes tied to his presidency, a dynamic some suggest helps explain why the military option is reportedly being held in reserve rather than used. One unresolved flashpoint remains the future management of the Strait of Hormuz, through which roughly a fifth of the world's oil and gas normally flows. Iran has pushed to charge tolls on vessels transiting the waterway. The U.S. insists it should remain free to transit, and Vice President Vance has said publicly the U.S. won't accept Iran collecting tolls there. Iran's parliamentary speaker, Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf, has separately said Iran's oil exports have surged since the blockade was lifted. More than 40 million barrels, he said, versus almost none during the blockade period, though that figure has not been independently verified by outside auditors. Separately, tensions tied to the broader regional conflict continue elsewhere. Israeli forces conducted strikes against Hezbollah positions in southern Lebanon over the weekend, targeting fighters near Nabatea, even as a separate ceasefire in that conflict formally remains in place. And shipping through the Strait of Hormuz remains uneven. Iranian authorities continue warning vessels to stay within their designated navigation corridor near Larak Island. At least one foreign-flagged vessel was reported aground in the strait this week after straying from that route, according to Iranian state broadcaster IRIB, a claim CBS News notes it has not been able to independently verify. Iran has also pushed for the release of roughly $6 billion in frozen assets tied to an earlier agreement, though reporting on the current state of those funds comes from a single outlet and is not independently confirmed, so we're flagging it rather than reporting it as settled fact. So where does this leave things? According to the Wall Street Journal, the military option Trump reportedly discussed with his top defense officials hasn't disappeared. It's being held in reserve while Witkoff and Kushner work the diplomatic channel in Doha. This ceasefire has already survived one broken agreement, a blockade, and a full shooting war in the last 12 months. The real test now is the August 18th deadline for a permanent nuclear agreement, one Trump has reportedly signaled he's in no rush to enforce. Whether the current pause holds may come down to whether both sides can avoid another weekend like the last one. We'll be following the Doha talks and any further military developments as they happen. Let us know in the comments. Do you think diplomacy holds this time? Or are we headed back to open conflict with Iran?